Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn c7 to c6. Knight b1 to c3. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight g1 to f3. Bishop c8 to g4. Pawn h2 to h3. Bishop g4 takes f3. Queen d1 takes f3. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d3. Knight g8 to f6. Bishop c1 to e3. Pawn d5 to d4. Bishop f1 to e2. Pawn c6 to c5. Castle kingside. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop e3 to f4. Pawn e6 to e5. Bishop f4 to g5. Pawn d4 takes c3. Pawn b2 takes c3. Pawn h7 to h6. Bishop g5 to e3. Bishop f8 to d6. Rook f1 to b1. Queen d8 to d7. Rook b1 to b5. Knight c6 to d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Queen d7 takes b5. Pawn a2 to a4. Queen b5 to b2. Pawn d4 takes c5. Queen b2 takes a1, check. Bishop e2 to d1. Bishop d6 to c7. Pawn c2 to c4. Rook a8 to c8. Queen f3 to f5. Queen a1 takes d1, check. King g1 to h2. Rook c8 to d8. Pawn c5 to c6. Pawn b7 takes c6. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn e5 takes f4. Bishop e3 takes a7. Queen d1 takes a4. Pawn e4 to e5. Queen a4 to a5. Pawn d3 to d4. Bishop c7 to d6. Queen f5 takes f4. Knight f6 to h5. Queen f4 to f5. Pawn g7 to g6. Bishop a7 to b6. Queen a5 to b4. Queen f5 to e4. Queen b4 takes b6. Pawn e5 takes d6, check. King e8 to d7. Queen e4 to e7, check. King d7 to c8. Pawn g2 to g4. Rook h8 to e8. Pawn d6 to d7, check. Rook d8 takes d7. Queen e7 takes e8, check. Queen b6 to d8. Queen e8 takes d8, check. King c8 takes d8. Pawn g4 takes h5. Pawn g6 takes h5. King h2 to g2. Pawn f7 to f5. King g2 to f3. Rook d7 takes d4. Pawn c4 to c5. Rook d4 to c4. King f3 to e3. Rook c4 to h4. King e3 to d3. King d8 to c7. King d3 to c3. Pawn f5 to f4. King c3 to d4. Pawn f4 to f3, check. King d4 to d3. Pawn f3 to f2. King d3 to e2. Rook h4 to f4. King e2 to f1. Pawn h5 to h4. King f1 to e2. Pawn f2 to f1, promoting to queen, check. King e2 to e3. Queen f1 to f3, check. King e3 to d2. Rook f4 to d4, check. King d2 to e1. Rook d4 to d1, checkmate.